Later on in the textbook chapter, there's discussion of bounded willpower, bounded self-interest, bounded ethicality, and bounded awareness. I don't necessarily love the way the textbook authors frame these ideas. I don't think it's the case that we're bounded necessarily by irrational biases in the same sense as the other examples. For instance, let's consider the dictator game. In the dictator game, two players are in the laboratory, and one of the players, player A, is given a quantity of something. Let's say they're given $10 or 10 pieces of candy or 10 tokens that can be traded for prizes or something of value. They get all of it, and they have essentially all of the power to dictate how that quantity will be split between them and the other player, player B. So player A is the dictator. They could keep everything for themselves. They could split it equally. They could give more to the other player, but the other player has a little bit of power. The other player basically gets to make the choice of whether to accept the deal or not. If they accept the deal that player A has suggested, then each gets whatever player A suggested. If they reject the deal, then neither player gets nothing. It is rational for player A to make an incredibly unbalanced distribution. In other words, let's say you have $10 to distribute. It would be most advantageous for player A to say, I'm going to keep $9 and you, player B, only get $1. Why is that rational? Well, obviously, it's more money for player A. Player B, the rational choice is to accept whatever player A chooses, no matter what, because if player B rejects the deal, nobody gets anything anyway. So for player B, even a really lopsided deal is totally worth it. Better to get $1 than nothing, right? However, that's not how most people usually play the game. Usually, the person in the dictator position, player A, makes a fairly equitable distribution. And it's not always exactly 50-50, but it's pretty close. The average is like 55% for player A, 45% for player B. Again, knowing that if player A gets a little bit more, that's good for them, and player B should probably just accept no matter what so they can get something. This doesn't mean we're irrational or driven by biases outside of awareness, or that we're bounded in terms of self-interest. It turns out that this means we're actually pretty rational about social behaviors. The reason that we're rational is because we care about our reputation in our social communities. We don't want other people to think of us as greedy and selfish. We want others to think of us as pro-social. We want others to hold us in high regard. There may come a time in which someone like player A is put into the position of player B, and they would want the person in the other position, the dictator position, to treat them fairly and equitably and give them their fair share of the resource. So this is why I don't think it's irrational, and why I actually think it's quite rational, considering that we care about our own reputations in the social world. Now imagine a different scenario here, which I call the fudge factor scenario. Imagine you're a volunteer in an experiment that involves solving a number of puzzles. You are going to be paid a fixed amount for each puzzle completed successfully within a certain period of time. The experimenter asks you to check your puzzle answers against an answer key, and then put your puzzle papers through a paper shredder so that no one will see the results, and then self-report the number that you got correct. So basically, people are told they're going to be paid for the amount of puzzles they solve, and they can evaluate their own score, and nobody's going to check them to see if they cheated. So what would you do? Would you claim to have solved a lot more puzzles than you actually did so that you could get paid more? Well, most people do over-report, but not by very much. We're not all callous liars in situations like these. If a person solves 8 puzzles, maybe they'll say they solved 9, but they're not going to say that they solved 27 on average. We see this kind of fudge factor in a lot of different places. People might fudge a little bit on their resume or on their online dating profile, but it's never going to be a complete lie. No one's going to say they're fluent in another language if they can't speak a word of it. No one's going to say they earn $200,000 a year if they only make $70,000. but they might say that they make 72,000 if it makes them look better. So in this sense, we lie consistently in daily life, but the amount that we lie is usually very small, and it happens so frequently that we kind of take it for granted. We kind of see it as negligible in the long-term scheme of things. I want to end with one of my favorite quotes from the behavioral economist Dan Ariely. Imagine you're in charge of designing highways, and you plan them under the assumption that all people drive perfectly. What would such rational road designs look like? Certainly, we would not have cut lines on the side of the road that make a brrr sound when you drive over them, because all people are expected to drive perfectly straight down the middle of the lane. We would also make the width of the lanes much closer to the width of the car, eliminate all speed limits, and fill traffic lanes to 100% of their capacity. There's no question this would be a more rational way to build roads. But of course, this is a system that we would not want to drive in. When it comes to designing things in our physical world, we all understand how flawed we are, and we design the physical world around us accordingly. We realize that we can't run very fast or far, so we invent cars and design public transportation. We understand our physical limitations, so we design steps, electric lights, heating, cooling, etc., to overcome those deficiencies. Sure, it would be nice to run around very fast and leap tall buildings like Superman and see in the dark and adjust to every temperature, but this is not how we're built. So we expend a lot of effort trying to take those limitations into account and use technologies to overcome them. What I find amazing is that when it comes to designing the mental and cognitive realm of the world, we somehow assume that human beings are without bounds. We cling to the idea that we are fully rational beings, and like mental supermen, we can figure out how to do anything. Why are we so readily willing to admit our physical limitations, but are unwilling to take our cognitive limitations into account? When we design things like healthcare and retirement and stock markets, we somehow forget the idea that we're limited. I think if we understood our cognitive limitations in the same way that we understand our physical limitations, that we could design a better world.